A lot of people believe that Islam Makhachev, especially after UFC 302, will dominate the welterweight division much like he has dominated the lightweight division. Well, I am here to tell you that I do not think that's true, and in this video, I'm going to make my case as to exactly why. And in order to do that, what I'm going to do is go through the top 10 fighters at welterweight and then quickly give you my assessment as to how I think Islam would do against them. Now, as always, I will timestamp all the different sections of this video down in the progress bar, and I do have to ask that if you find you enjoy the video, please give it a like. That really helps things out, and I appreciate it. Also, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please consider doing that as well. I would love to have you on board for future content. Alright, so the first thing that I want to do is go back and talk about the fight at UFC 302. On one hand, Islam did answer a few of the questions I've had about him, specifically with regards to his cardio and his durability. But on the other hand, he did confirm my belief that he will not do nearly as well at welterweight. And I will obviously explain that a little bit later in this video, but first let me pay him the compliments. The last time we saw him at the 5-round mark was against Volkanovski in their first fight, and in that fight I thought he looked really gassed by the 5th round. So when he still looked pretty fresh in the 5th round of this fight and had enough energy to finish Dustin, that pretty much put to bed that question mark that I had for him. Also, because in most of his fights he does a great job of not taking a lot of damage, his toughness and durability were always unknowns for me. And while he didn't take a tremendous amount of damage in this fight, he did demonstrate that he is able to take some punishment. Also, he did confirm that he is able and willing to hang with the best strikers. He really didn't shy away from getting into a firefight with Dustin at all in that fight. Now, I do have to add to that, it was pretty apparent to me that Dustin was not fully letting go with his striking. And in my opinion, that hesitation is what allowed Islam to get the jump on Dustin in many of their exchanges. But nonetheless, you do have to give Islam the credit for having such a strong grappling game that he put Dustin in that position mentally. So with all that out of the way, let's get into the fun part and evaluate how he will do at welterweight. Just to kick this off, one of the high-level reasons that I don't think he will do nearly as well at welterweight is because he will lose a lot of the natural advantages that he relies on so heavily at lightweight, such as he is a big guy for the division and he is a dominant grappler in a group of largely strikers. At welterweight, he's going to be smaller than a lot of the guys in the division, and he will also have to contend with many more dominant grapplers in the top 10 of welterweight. But without further ado, let's jump into the top 10 of welterweight and assess how Islam might do against each of these guys. Starting with number 10, which is Geoff Neal, I do think this is a very winnable fight for Islam. Geoff Neal is unfortunately one of those guys who has a lot of natural talent and potential, but hardly ever seems to live up to it. And while I don't think it would be very smart for Islam to get into a striking battle with Geoff, I don't think that Geoff's grappling defense is nearly good enough to prevent Islam from taking him down and possibly submitting him. So in this fight, I would have Islam either by decision or by submission. Moving on to number 9, I think we have one of the most winnable fights for Islam in Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Whether it be Belal, Shavkat, or Gilbert Burns, we've all seen the movie of how Stephen Thompson does against dominant grapplers, and spoiler alert, it's not good. So once again, I think this is an easy decision or submission win for Islam. Next at number 8, we have Sean Brady, and I do think that Shaun could be a tougher test for Islam because he is such a good grappler. But I also think that Islam would be able to follow a similar game plan to Belal, and it's fair to say that Islam would have the striking advantage in this fight. So once again, I'm pretty comfortable saying that Islam would come out on top here and get a decision. Moving on down now to number 7, we have Ian Garry. And based on everything that I've seen from Ian so far in terms of grappling, this should be an easy win for Islam. One of the first videos I ever put up was about Ian, and in that video I went back to look at all of his old fights to see where he did well. And while there was not a lot of grappling to look at, the few times where it did happen, I thought Ian came out on the wrong side each time. Now I know that he says he's been working on that and he's much better at it, but the fact of the matter is we just have not seen it. So until we have some new information on that front, I think if this fight was to happen, Islam would be competitive enough in the striking to get inside on Ian, and then from there I think he could take him down any way that he wanted to. And at that point, if Ian doesn't have high-level grappling defense, I could easily see Islam catching him in some sort of a choke. But if Ian does have really good grappling defense, then I still think Islam would just ride him out to a comfortable decision. Alright, moving down once again, now we have Gilbert Burns at number 6. And this is the first time that I really believe Islam Makhachev would run into a brick wall at welterweight. Everything about Gilbert Burns is a bad matchup for Islam. He's thick, he's heavy, he's a world-class grappler who has explosive energy and power in his hands. And if the same Gilbert Burns shows up that fought Khamzat, I would absolutely favor Gilbert in that fight. But the one thing that could be in Islam's favor here is the fact that you never know what version of Gilbert Burns you're going to get. And on top of that, Gilbert Burns can be really good at finding ways to lose fights. If you haven't seen the video I did on him with the thumbnail titled Fumbled, in there I show you how he basically threw away a win against Della Maddalena. So if these two were to fight, I think Islam's best chance would actually be on the feet. But even in that scenario, I would be nervous for Islam the entire time because Gilbert Burns could put him away with one big shot. But because Islam is a smart fighter and Gilbert Burns does have a tendency to find ways to lose fights, I could see a possibility where Islam wins this one. But that doesn't change the fact that I think this is his biggest risk in the top 10 that we've covered yet. Okay, next at number 5, we have Jack Della Maddalena. And here again, I think this is one of the more easily winnable fights for Islam. Jack should have lost his last fight to Gilbert Burns if Gilbert Burns didn't make that critical error. And before that, Jack only skated by with a split decision over Kevin Holland. So basically, I've seen nothing from JDM to indicate he would be able to fend off Islam's wrestling. And because Islam is much more effective than somebody like Gilbert Burns at locking up submissions, I could very easily see Islam submitting Jack if he got him to the ground, which I think he would be able to do without much trouble. But if Jack's submission defense is on point, I could see this just going out to a decision where Islam would win, because unlike Gilbert Burns, I don't think that Islam would make critical grappling errors that would cost him the fight. Next up here at number 4, we have Colby Covington. And this is actually one of the fights I would be the most excited for Islam at welterweight. And while I believe that Islam would have the advantage in both the grappling and the striking here, I'm just curious to see how Colby would deal with all that, because the one thing that Colby often does have going for him in fights is the fact that he's crafty. So in terms of outcome here, the easiest thing for me to see is an Islam decision win. I feel like Colby's grappling is good enough to keep him out of serious danger here, and generally speaking, on the feet, he's good enough at maintaining whatever range he needs to not get too damaged. But like I said, I think Islam would rack up enough points here to take the decision. And assuming I'm right about that, we would move on then to number 3, which I think is another brick wall fight for Islam Makhachev. Because at the number 3 spot, we have Shavkat Rakhmonov. If I was to try to think of any area where Islam would have the advantage in this fight, I would have to think it's on the feet. But even that is very questionable. If we were going to compare who is more durable and can take more damage, I think that is Shavkat all day long. And when it comes to the grappling, I think Islam is certainly a more dominant wrestler. But when it comes to jiu-jitsu, I think they're very comparable. And because of all this, I think it's one of the most intriguing matchups possible for Islam at welterweight. But I can't help but think this would be a really difficult fight for Islam to win. And at this point in time, I would take Shavkat by decision. But if he was able to pull it off, we would then move on to number 2, which is Belal Muhammad. Now this is an interesting one because these guys have been training together recently. And so I'm sure both of them know from the training room who would actually have the advantage in a fight. Now we, the public, will not know that, so I'm just going to operate on what I know about Belal. And in doing that, I also think this would be a really difficult fight for Islam to win. I do feel like Islam would probably have the advantage in the striking a bit, and both of these guys have been knocked out with strikes before, so I'd probably give the edge there to Islam. But when it comes to the wrestling side of things, I'd probably have to keep it pretty neutral there. Belal himself is a pretty proficient grappler, and we haven't really seen much from him in the way of submissions, so I will give that edge again to Islam. But overall, I just feel like this is a pretty neutral fight, and I think the most likely outcome here for sure would be a decision. And the only question is who's going to get the most points to get the nod there. So at the end of the day, I really just feel like this fight is a coin flip. But if you think he's going to get through Belal, we will move on to number 1, which is Kamaru Usman. Now, in my opinion, this is perhaps the most difficult fight for Islam Makhachev at welterweight. If Kamaru Usman was able to survive the first round blitz from Khamzat Chimaev, there's no doubt in my mind he'd be able to survive anything that Islam would throw at him in the wrestling department. So not only do I think Kamaru Usman could shut down Islam's wrestling fully, but I also think it's possible he could take the advantage if they had a wrestling exchange. And when it comes to the striking, I think Kamaru has the advantage there as well. It is fair to say that Islam is perhaps the more dynamic striker, But when it comes to the power end of things, I think Kamaru takes that all day. So Islam would have to be really careful in the exchanges on the feet, because if he takes a power shot from Kamaru, that could be the end of the fight. But on the other hand, I don't think Kamaru would have to worry nearly as much about Islam's power, because as we saw against both Dustin and Alex Volkanovski in their first fight, while Islam does have good striking, he doesn't necessarily have big power. So with all that said, my opinion for this fight would be a pretty comfortable decision win for Kamaru Usman. But as we all know, if Islam is going to get a shot at 170, he's not going to have to go through all the contenders. He's going to go straight to the champion, which is obviously Leon Edwards. Now, this is also a fight I'd be really curious to see, because I think in this fight, the advantages for each person are pretty distinct. When it comes to the stand-up, Leon absolutely is going to have the advantage there. He'll have the reach, he'll have the power, and he'll have a pretty significant height advantage. I also think Leon is probably a more dynamic striker overall than Islam is, especially because of Leon's kicks. But when you switch over to the grappling, that is clearly going to be Islam. So the high-level question in this fight is, can Leon Edwards maintain his distance with striking and avoid being taken down? From Islam's perspective, the question is, can he get to Leon, especially after the defensive capability that Leon showed against Kamaru Usman in their second fight? And the one thing we all need to keep in mind is that Leon Edwards is a much better grappler than he used to be. And if we want to look at Leon in comparison to someone like Dustin Poirier, I believe that Leon Edwards would be a more difficult grappling test for Islam Makhachev than Dustin Poirier was. And since Dustin was able to survive into the middle of the 5th round, there's a great chance that this fight would end up as a decision. And if it does go to decision, I think I'd have to give the edge to Leon Edwards, because that would probably mean he avoided too much trouble from Islam and was able to rack up points throughout the fight using his reach. But if Islam was able to get to Leon the way that Colby did, it's fair to say that Leon would be in a lot more danger than he ever was with Colby, and in that case, I could see him getting caught in a submission. So there really are just a lot of fun variables with this hypothetical matchup. But at this point, if I had to put money on the way I think this fight would go, I think it would be a situation where Islam puts up a good fight but comes up short, much like Alex Volkanovski did against him in their first fight. So there you have it, folks. That's my breakdown of how I think Islam Makhachev would fare within the top 10 at welterweight. But now it's your turn, and I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. Do you agree with my assessment on this, or do you have a different idea of how he would do there? And before I let you go, I haven't talked about this in my last couple of videos, but back in my Conor versus Chandler video from a few weeks ago, I announced a giveaway I was going to be doing at 1,000 subscribers. I'm not going to go into much detail about it in here, and I'm not going to put anything in the description of this video because I'm not sure if it negatively impacted my views on that one. But if you want to hear about that, go back and watch that video for those details. And then all you have to do is follow the criteria if you want to be included. So that's going to be it for today. Again, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, and also, once again, subscribe to the channel if you're not already. I really appreciate all of you being here, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.